Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this particular featured event. Our featured event is about strengthening partnership towards disaster risk reduction for small island developing states. My name is Gyan Chandra Acharya. I'm High Representative for the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. Distinguished Deputy Secretary General, Commissioner, Ministers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this featured event on strengthening partnerships towards disaster risk reduction for small island developing states. This event has been co-organized by my office, the UN Office for High Representative, and the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. This is a timely event for small island developing states. Many important events are scheduled to take place in the coming years. As we prepare for the upcoming 3rd International Conference on Small Island Developing States in 2014 in Samoa, 2nd review of the Hyogo Framework for Action in 2015, and as we intensify our discourse on the post-2015 development agenda, it's important that the issue of disaster risk reduction in general, but for one of the most vulnerable group of countries like SIDS in particular, be highlighted at an international forum such as this. It is obvious to us all that vulnerability to disasters due to their high level of exposure, recurrence, and now increased ferocity of these disasters, combined with the very limited capacity to deal with them, puts the SIDS countries on an unenviable position. When you have a large number of population living just a few meters above the sea level, a country like Kiribati has over 90% of people living just about 5 meters above the sea level, and similar is the case, I understand, of the Maldives. Basic economic infrastructure and means of livelihood is completely exposed to the vagaries of nature. And when the means of livelihood is precarious and capacity limited, you have to think about disasters in a holistic manner, and that is from the fundamental perspective of survival and sustainability of livelihoods and development efforts. Yet the resilience of the people of small islands is phenomenal. The global community working together must help them with innovative ways and means to reinforce their capacity in the face of acute adversity. SIDS countries have always represented this indomitable spirit of survival, resilience, and regeneration. This is a lesson for humanity, but this is also a time for solidarity. There is an opportunity to build resilience with a multi-stakeholder approach. There has to be a stronger global partnership. As part of the problem of ferocity of disasters lies at the global level. At the country and regional levels, they are taking initiatives. They include Micronesian Challenge Initiative, Caribbean Challenge Initiative, Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and similar facility in the making for the Pacific are some of the good examples. The support for the SIDS need to be ramped up with global partnership. Innovative business partnerships should also be enhanced and sped up. Civil society should be fully engaged, and communities need to be fully involved. To talk about all these aspects, but in particular about the challenges as well as opportunities, and the need for strengthening global partnership in favor of SIDS, we have the honor of having with us today a very distinguished panelist, which indicates the great value placed upon the issues, concerns, and aspirations of SIDS. We are not talking about them and their livelihood only, but as the custodian of large oceanscape, we are contributing to the preservation and protection of the global public goods by helping them deal with the sudden and devastating disasters and slow motion disasters, both natural as well as anthropogenic. Natural disasters are a fact of life, but their devastating impacts should not be. Therefore, without further ado, I now have the great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Jan Eliasson, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, someone who has been a strong advocate and passionate about the interests of small island developing states. He was involved, he was fascinated by the seas and oceans early on, as he has said a couple of times, and we would like to have, the SIDS issue has always been very close to his heart. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kian, and very good to see you here at this very important meeting. And I want to thank you for this chance to discuss this critical issue of reducing the risk of disasters in small island developing states. I will call them SIDS from now on so that you don't hear that repeated all the time. And I'm pleased to see representatives from these countries and others who know that this issue is basically about life and death. I often use the metaphor canaries in the coal mine. I hope you don't mind that I use that phrase, because you are on that edge of existence being threatened. And when you hear the voices from those islands where you see the fresh water being completely destroyed by salt water and people moving in from the outer islands into the main island, and there's relocation plans for the population in 30 to 40 years, we should listen. I think it's our absolute obligation to listen to those who see this as a matter of absolute survival. We may have plans in life for other things. You know, remember the expression, what is your plan B? But I give you one line when it comes to the environment and the climate. We have no planet B. There is no planet B, and we better realize it. One of the most stark and heartbreaking examples for me was the massive earthquake in Haiti. After decades of environmental destruction, political instability, and uneven or lack of investments in education and health, a huge earthquake struck the country, as we all know. The staggering human suffering was compounded by a loss of some 15% of Haiti's GDP, 15% of its GDP. At the same time, that year, Cyclone Evan cost Samoa 1/3 of its annual economic output. And over a decade, Jamaica's annual losses equal about 2.5% of its average annual investment. Hurricanes mostly giving reason to that. The human, but also the business case for action is clear. I think this was made clear this morning in the session that at least Jose was moderating. When a disaster strikes, the immediate damage is just the first problem. Over time, the affected areas will have to cope with lasting economic shocks. On average, a country's debt-to-GDP ratio increases almost 25 percentage points in 3 years following a disaster. For small island developing states, recurrent disasters deepen debt. And this is the automatic effect. Governments spend so much on rebuilding that they cannot provide the same level of basic services to their citizens, which causes, of course, grave social and individual problems. This third international conference on small islands, developing states, next year in Samoa, offers an important opportunity to build political commitment, launch partnerships, and take action. I hope that disaster risk reduction will receive due attention. I'm sure it will. Our discussions today, the conference in Samoa, and other dialogues on the risks facing SIDS can contribute to the global process of forging a new vision for the post-2015 development agenda. The reason why this has to land on the development agenda is that it is, as you know, mostly poor people who are directly affected. They were the ones paying the price in Haiti. They were the price in different floods, living in dangerous areas, paying the price first. That's why this is part of the development agenda that we have to do together. In this effort, we should draw on lessons from the past to forge a safer future. At the same time, we cannot wait for full agreement on the next Sustainable Development Agenda to strengthen the collaboration between SIDS and their development partners. A renewed global partnership must aim to help countries manage multiple risks so that they can pursue economic growth, social development, and environmental sustainability. Last year's Rio conference reaffirmed the special development needs of these countries. They suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change, and they deserve and should have additional assistance. They collectively contribute, and this is ironic, isn't it? Less than 1% of total carbon dioxide emissions, less than 1% of carbon emissions. But losses from climate-related disasters may affect their entire economy and territory, and in fact, as I said earlier, endanger their very existence. Since small island development states are on the front lines of the climate crisis, I expect their situation will be at the top of the agenda at the summer conference. And the business community can help strengthen the economies of small island development states, and major investments can be made which can and should be targeted to address risks in the enlightened self-interest also of business. When we think of small island development states, many of us imagine paradise still, don't we? The tourism pictures. That's why they attract so many looking for tranquility and life at the seaside. Now, governments should work with business to promote investments in tourism which address risk and support sustainable development, including employment opportunities. So here is a relationship between the environmental and the economic factors for countries which are often depending on tourism. Now, in closing, small island developing states have paid close attention to climate change and disaster risk for decades. Their leaders and their people knew that these issues were important long before they rose to the top of the global agenda. I count on small island development states to continue to lead the way with ideas, innovation, and energy to strengthen partnerships that benefit everybody. And we must all listen to them. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Eliasson, for your thoughtful presentation, especially about existential threat, but also about structural constraints, development challenges, and the nexus between development and environment. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. David Vassir, Minister for the Interior of the Republic of Haiti. Haiti has borne the brunt of frequent and devastating disasters, yet the resilience of the people has been inspirational. Haiti is recognized as one of the most disaster-affected countries in the world. In 2010, a devastating earthquake claimed over 220,000 lives. Even today, an estimated 1.5 million people still require basic humanitarian assistance. We will hear more about that and other issues from His Excellency the Minister of Haiti. You have the floor, sir.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Deputy Secretary General, distinguished members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the government of Haiti, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak on behalf of my country in this World Forum on the reduction of the risk of disaster. And unfortunately, we've all too often been featured in the international media with our flooded cities, collapsed houses, and mourning population. So we need to take this opportunity to renew our people's thanks for the universal solidarity which we've enjoyed in our time of mourning and desolation. We were stricken by that major earthquake on the 10th of January 12th of January 2010. I was going to say 2012. Anyway, in January 2010, and at a difficult time in the life of our country, we were able to benefit from active international solidarity, firefighters from Guadeloupe and Martinique, relief teams from the English-speaking countries around us, and the Dominican Republic. All of these people brought assistance and friendship to our people. We were struck by an earthquake, and we were scarred by the constraints facing all SIDS. Even though we share our island with the Dominican Republic, the main feature of our relationship with other countries around us requires sea and air transport. An exceptional shuttle service of peaking at 300 aircraft per day brought us out of isolation in the days after the earthquake and showed that it's not easy to be an island with such major disasters. We share a common history, so we and our neighbors in the Caribbean are coming even closer together, as was never the case before. There is true regional integration, which is now developing for economic and political events, and this is being done through CARICOM. We are separated by the seas, but nevertheless we are close to our neighbors in geographical terms. The environment, the climate, shared living lifestyles bring us close together, and the technical experts are developing concepts and projects to bring us even closer. The biological link between Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic is one example. Climate change is another area where we can have a meeting of minds. Over the last few months, there have been increasing contacts amongst technical experts, and Haiti was able to take part in the main meetings in the islands on controlling and managing land and sea weather phenomena. We have approached the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in Belize, and we take advantage of the studies and modeling work developed in other Caribbean countries to try to anticipate climate change in our country, whilst awaiting for our institutions to take over in developing climate knowledge and awareness. Thus, we know that we can expect an increase in rainfall in areas where it already rains a lot. More frequent, heavier, thus more destructive rains. We also know that the dry areas will dry out even more. And what our peasant farmers tell us chimes with what we're told by Caribbean climate experts. We can't now predict what's going to happen with our farming cycles. Without capacity to anticipate climate change effects in Haiti, we were nevertheless able to rely on knowledge accumulated by our neighbors to determine a national strategy and to obtain resources from the Climate Investment Fund. SIDS will be among those most sorely affected by climate change. That is something certain. Just as it's certain that regional solidarity alone, we really need this in order to establish effective risk and disaster management policies in order to ensure that we can manage things to ensure the well-being of our population. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister David Bashir, for expressing gratitude for the solidarity that it received from the international community when it was hit by the earthquake, but also you talked about regional integration, climate change effects, and how the small island states have to face all these impacts in their livelihood. Thank you for your presentation. Now I have a request that Dr. Pachauri has another engagement, speaking engagement, so I have to give him the floor a little bit early with your indulgence. I would like to invite Dr. Rajendra Pachauri. You all know the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and our good friend who has not only led the scientific analysis of the climate change but also exhibited enormous energy to rally the world around to promote science and policy interface on the one hand and policy and action on the ground on the other. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm privileged to be given this opportunity, and I would focus essentially on some of the findings of a special report that we brought out in 2011 dealing with extreme events and disasters. And in this, of course, we focused specifically, apart from other regions of the world, on the small island developing states. And I'd like to mention a few points for the consideration of this audience. I'm sure these are facts which are very well known, but they certainly deserve repetition and emphasis. We know that many SIDS face special disadvantages associated with their small size, their insularity, their remoteness, and susceptibility to natural hazards. SIDS are particularly vulnerable to climate change because their key economic sectors, such as agriculture, fisheries, and tourism, are all susceptible. The hazards of extreme weather events are coupled with other long-term climate change impacts, especially sea level rise. And may I emphasize the fact that increase in mean sea level is also resulting in extreme coastal flooding, as a result of which clearly the threat to the SIDS is substantially higher than those locations which are far away from the sea. Low-lying atoll communities such as the Maldives and Cook Islands are especially vulnerable. Small island states, and particularly atoll countries, may experience erosion, inundation, and saline intrusion, resulting in ecosystem disruption, decreased agricultural productivity, changes in disease patterns, economic losses, and population displacement, all of which reinforce vulnerability to extreme weather events. SIDS also suffer higher relative economic losses from natural hazards. This is a point that you made very effectively, Mr. Chairman, this morning. So that one extreme event may have the effect of countering years of development gains. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind, because if the global community has to be concerned and be active in dealing with some of the problems that the SIDS are facing, then we must realize that overall those measures which are essentially focused on prevention and adaptation are far more cost-effective than instituting relief measures once damage has taken place. The distances between many SIDS and economic centers make their populations among the most isolated in the world, and susceptibility to disasters as well as the lack of development are mutually reinforcing. Disasters not only cause heavy losses to capital assets, but also disrupt production and the flow of goods and services in the affected economy, resulting in a loss of earnings. So I'd like to emphasize the fact that the threat of these disasters also carries with it the threat of a lack of development opportunities, and as a matter of fact, can actually provide a major setback in whatever gains have been established through development. In both the short and the long term, those impacts can have sharp repercussions on the economic development of a country, affecting GDP, public finances, and foreign trade, thus increasing levels of poverty and public debt. Climate change threatens a large number of the small island development states, and I'd like to highlight the fact that they could exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and hinder socio-economic development. Some of the case studies that we have presented in this, particularly for the Republic of the Marshall Islands, we have shown that these islands face major climate-related natural hazards, including sea level rise, tropical storms or typhoons, with associated storm surges and drought. These hazards should be considered within the context of additional hazards and challenges, such as ecosystem degradation, pollution of the marine environment, and coastal erosion, as well as food security. Now, I'm highlighting all these impacts because there is a need, therefore, to ensure that we put in place infrastructure, institutional measures, and a whole range of actions by which we can bring about adaptation to some of these impacts in the future. But let me also emphasize that purely taking adaptation measures will not be adequate. because clearly we would reach certain thresholds and benchmarks, as a result of which the challenge in adapting to some of these extreme events will become extremely severe. And therefore, on a global basis, there is no getting away from the fact that we also have to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. And therefore, the global community has a special responsibility to some of these small island developing states, whereby we make sure that the ability that these states have of being able to live in a risk-free or a low-risk environment and be able to pursue sustainable development is upheld. Here, let me remind this August gathering about Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is really the central core of the Framework Convention, and it aims to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now here, let me say that you cannot arrive at an understanding of what would represent a dangerous level of anthropogenic interference on an average basis. This, of course, involves a value judgment, because what someone considers dangerous may not accord with what I consider dangerous. But we must keep one important fact in mind. The extent to which you might be able to define and establish benchmarks for danger will vary from one place to the other. And clearly, if Article 2 of the Framework Convention is to apply, then it must use the actual situation in the SIDS to be able to determine what might represent dangerous. So this is something in which the global community has to spend a lot of time and effort. We are trying to look at the scientific underpinnings of Article 2 in the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, but I'm afraid we will not be able to define what represents dangerous, because that involves a value judgment. But if that value judgment is to face the reality of what's going to happen in different regions of the world, then clearly the small island developing states must be at the forefront of defining what might represent dangerous. So I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to assure this August gathering that in the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, we are certainly going to pay attention to some of the specific impacts of climate change on the SIDS and the challenges that they're likely to face on a scientific basis in assessing the impacts of climate change and the options that the global community has of being able to deal with this major challenge in the future. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri, for highlighting the climate change and weather-related events' impact on their SIDS, but also talking about sea level rise as well as coastal erosion, and in fact, the setback, the probable setback they will have in terms of the development gains. I think it is particularly important that you emphasized on need for a bold mitigation measures, and also you promised that there will be special study on the SIDS in the 5th assessment report. I think these are very important contributions. I thank you for your presentation. Now I would like to invite next speaker, His Excellency Mr. James Fletcher, Minister of the Public Service, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology of St. Lucia. St. Lucia is hit hard by hurricanes. When the last one, Thomas, hit it in 2010, the loss was humongous. HECLAC put the total cost of damage and losses at US $336.2 million. There are other storms that strike it regularly as well. Let us hear about the challenges that it faces, but also the efforts made by St. Lucia to deal with them. You have the floor, sir.
Deputy Secretary General, Chairman, Excellencies, good afternoon. Allow me first of all to thank the UNISDR for the invitation to participate in this conference and the government and people of Switzerland for their hospitality. I also wish on behalf of the government and people of St. Lucia to extend condolences to the residents of Moore, Oklahoma, who lost loved ones and suffered severe infrastructure damage from the passage of yesterday's killer tornado. Mr. Chairman, every year, those of us who live in the Caribbean anticipate with a certain degree of dread the announcement of the forecast for the Atlantic hurricane season, which begins on June 1st and ends on November 30th. The reason for this is simple. We live in a hurricane belt, and most of us know and have witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of hurricanes and storms. These extreme weather events are particularly severe on our key economic sectors of agriculture and tourism. They devastate economies, destroy livelihoods, damage infrastructure, and they take lives. Therefore, as individual countries and as a region, we are all very conscious of the need to build societies, countries, and a region that is resilient in the face of natural disasters. The frightening reality, however, is that while the small island developing states of the Caribbean region are among the nations particularly vulnerable to severe weather-related events, earthquakes, and other natural disasters, this risk is increasing with climate change. We now have to prepare for the likelihood of more frequent and severe storms and more intense and protracted droughts. We also have to devise ways to deal with the loss and damage from slow onset impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, saltwater intrusion, and its impacts on our agricultural lands and supplies of drinking water. To further compound matters, most countries in the Caribbean, St. Lucia included, are currently confronted with high levels of debt and anemic economic growth. The recent global economic crisis has hit our region hard and has caused an uncomfortable increase in the levels of unemployment, particularly among our young people. Therefore, our governments have limited fiscal space to maneuver, and they constantly have to balance the need to respond to the urgent problems of today with the desire to take action to address the pressing imperatives of tomorrow. The question for this meeting, then, is what can we do in this current environment to avoid or minimize the trauma that natural disasters will cause to our people, governments, economies, and countries. The islands of the Caribbean share the same risks when natural disasters are concerned, so it makes sense to approach risk mitigation on a regional level, whenever and wherever practicable. There are regional institutions in the Caribbean, such as the Caribbean Disaster Management Agency, CDEMA, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Environmental Health Institute, CEHI, and the Secretariat of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States that have mandates related to disaster risk reduction and have accumulated varying levels of expertise and experience in this area. They can benefit from knowledge sharing with and technical support from international agencies involved in disaster risk reduction. These regional agencies have also been at the forefront of conducting training programs and sensitizing policymakers on the myriad elements of hazard and risk management. Support for these training programs would therefore go a long way in assisting regional agencies to carry out this important function. However, this partnership should flow in both directions. Therefore, some of the initiatives that have already been successfully undertaken within the Caribbean region, such as the vulnerability benchmarking tool used in the OECS member states and the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, are experiences that may be shared with the international community. Early warning systems can be critical in reducing the impacts of natural disasters and saving lives. However, SIDS in the Caribbean are at varying stages of advancement with respect to early warning capability for events such as storms, floods, and tsunamis. It is vital, therefore, that we ensure all SIDS achieve a state where early warning systems for predictable disasters are sufficiently developed and deployed to enable timely preparation and response. Within the community of SIDS, there has been some progress in terms of information and data gathering and analysis. There remains a need, however, to expand and strengthen capability in the areas of research, systematic observation, data acquisition, management, and analysis in support of decision-making. This is another area where international partnerships can be beneficial. We have to strengthen spatial planning and building guidelines. If buildings, roads, bridges, ports, and other infrastructure are appropriately designed, built, and situated, the potential for damage and loss can be significantly reduced. Of even greater significance, however, is the need for investments in the relocation, strengthening, and reconstruction of key bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure in keeping with the new guidelines. We all recognize the importance of mainstreaming our efforts in hazard risk management so as to ensure a more integrated approach and reduce the burden on any one central agency. However, in terms of praxis, island nations, due to institutional, cultural, and other barriers, continue to struggle with this requirement. Consequently, we would be more than willing to learn and benefit from the experiences of others who have been able to effectively integrate disaster risk reduction into all aspects of national planning and development. While small geographic and population size may pose constraints, they also present opportunities that can be capitalized on. By way of example, my home country, St. Lucia, has, over the years, developed a network of community disaster preparedness committees. These committees are proving increasingly effective, not just in preparing communities prior to and during hurricane alerts, but also in providing post-event first response and conducting initial assessments. Their efforts are especially critical where communities have been cut off by landslide, flood, or other obstacles. While there is certainly a need to strengthen the network through the provision of equipment and further training, we would be more than happy to share our experiences with this form of decentralized disaster risk reduction. Overall, therefore, it is clear that there are many avenues for partnering to increase the resilience of SIDS in the face of disasters. Taking advantage of these opportunities and addressing the outstanding needs within SIDS would be fully consistent with the 5 priority areas for action under the IOGO framework. However, it is important for the international community to recognize the current economic and social constraints confronting SIDS and assist us with the requisite technical and financial support that will allow this very vulnerable group of countries to make the needed interventions and investments today that will make possible a safer tomorrow. If we accept the research findings that show for every $1 spent on risk reduction, between $10 and $30 can be saved in post-disaster recovery and reconstruction, we recognize why such support now is in all of our interests. It is my strongest hope that coming out of this meeting, there will be concrete action in fulfillment of these priorities as we attempt to build more resilient island societies. I thank you.
I thank Your Excellency, Mr. James Fletcher, for your contribution, especially focusing on the need for partnership to build early warning system, resilient infrastructure, as well as the technical and financial cooperation for dealing with the disasters. I thank you for your contribution. Now I would like to invite Her Excellency Ms. Nikki Kai, Minister of Civil Defence of New Zealand. You are all aware that New Zealand experienced a 6.3 magnitude earthquake in the Canterbury and particular city of Christchurch in 2011. This has been the most destructive and costly natural disaster in New Zealand's history, and I was told that this is one of the highest in terms of the ratio to GDP, so almost 20% of the GDP, in the developed countries, of course. Besides that, there have many active volcanoes, and New Zealand has also been providing a lot of support in the countries in the region as well as beyond. So we would like to invite you, Madam Minister, to talk about your experience as well as your cooperation.
Haere mai, talofa lava, bulavanaka, malo lale. Can I say warm greetings from the Pacific, but also warm greetings to the Pacific nations that are represented here today. I recognise that I'm on the platform, but there are many nations that are represented from the Pacific that will and hopefully have a stronger voice as a result of the platform in Samoa next year. I intend to focus my comments on our experience of supporting Pacific Island nations. We feel a very strong responsibility. As you know, we have been through Canterbury, but many of the nations are our family. And so we do focus our aid program specifically on assisting them in this area. And I'm going to touch on some of the areas that we are practically, both in terms of the capability, strengthening their systems, but also some of the specific projects that we're focusing on. We do think we share, as a small island developed nation, a lot with SIDS. We're also very highly prone in terms of hazards, like many SIDS nations. And so one of the things that we are trying to do with the Pacific nations is really strengthen their capability. We're doing that through supporting their national disaster management plans and procedures. We are assisting their national disaster management officers in terms of practical support. We've also, the New Zealand Ministry of Civil Defence, I'll refer to it as MICDEM, that is not a hamburger, but it is the New Zealand Civil Defence Agency. We're supporting many nations in the Pacific through training and professional development. For instance, we support a Disaster Awareness Week activities in both Tonga and the Cook Islands. We're also focused on engaging with local communities and villages on disaster awareness and preparedness. We've got exercises that enable the national officers right across the Cook Islands, Tonga and Samoa to practice and test procedures. We also do practical assistance in emergencies, and an example of that was Tropical Cyclone Heta in Niue. And I just want to briefly touch on, because I want to give the opportunity, obviously people have many questions, some of those practical projects that we feel, particularly because we've got a strong investment in science, for instance, that we can assist some of the nations in the Pacific. So in 2009, the Pacific tsunami in Samoa, many people lost their lives because they could not get to higher ground. And so we are assisting in a tsunami mapping exercise, which was recently completed. And I think that is really about building that capability of the local community in Samoa. We're involved in a 5-year program around volcano monitoring in Vanuatu. We're using New Zealand geological hazards expertise to assist Vanuatu in raising awareness of volcanic risk and to strengthen monitoring and mitigation systems for the 3 highest risk volcanoes. We're involved in disaster risk reduction in Fiji. Obviously, the 2009 floods and subsequent cyclones Mick and Thomas caused severe damage to infrastructure and houses. So the New Zealand Aid Program is assisting in meeting critical infrastructure needs. Kiribati, we're involved there. We've scaled up our development assistance program in Kiribati to include a safer and more climate-resistant serving housing subdivision. In the Cook Islands, we provided funding of $6.4 million. I think, just to sort of sum up, the point that I would make is we recognise, even though we've gone through an extraordinary event, we have a strong responsibility to assist the Pacific. We do see that while we are assisting the Pacific, there are many areas of collaboration that are absolutely relevant to all SIDS. And I think we're very committed to supporting Samoa in the successful hosting of SIDS in 2014. Specifically, as a friend, and we call ourselves a family member, we have offered to personally support Samoa with some of the challenges of presented with a small nation hosting this conference. So finally, I just want to recognise again the Pacific nations represented in this room, and our goal, partly as a result of Samoa, is to ensure, and obviously also as a result of everyone today, really ensure that SIDS get a strong voice on a global platform. And it's very encouraging to hear some of the comments that have been mentioned today, because we practically know that's how difficult it is to deal with when you're a small nation, to deal with a major event. And I think one thing that really sticks in my mind is ensuring that whatever we spend money on, we get really high impact, whether it's preparedness in terms of projects. So we've really tried to do that in terms of science investment and focusing specifically on those projects of needs in the Pacific where we think we'll be able to help save lives and build capability. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Minister Nikki Kaye, for sharing us with what you are doing in terms of lending support to the SIDS countries in the Pacific region, especially in the early warning, monitoring, disaster reduction efforts, and many other disaster risk management issues. Thank you very much for your collaboration. Now, I would also like to request all the speakers. I've been asked that you should be making a statement at a reasonable speed so that the interpreters will be really able to translate that. Now I would like to invite Her Excellency Ms. Marisa Moraes, Minister of Internal Affairs of the Republic of Cape Verde, to provide her remarks. Cape Verde is another island with volcanic eruptions, seismic activity, flooding, cyclones, as well as many other man-made catastrophes. But it has also made a lot of efforts in bringing together all the relevant actors under the national platform for disaster risk reduction. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the panel, distinguished delegates and participants, ladies and gentlemen, Once again, I take this opportunity to thank you for the invitation of UNISDR to be here today and to speak on behalf of my country at this important meeting. Well, small island developing countries are among the most vulnerable to natural disasters and to the impact of climate change. We have heard today a very useful description of what happens in island states, but also you mentioned the example of the canary. If we see, then there's a question, do we consider a canary to be a woman? Women, no, it's usually men who go down to the mine, but canaries which stay. And that's perhaps true for other parts of life. This seems to me to apply rather well to SIDS. Disaster risk reduction for Cape Verde and for all SIDS is a critical issue which can't be dealt with in an isolated way and needs to be addressed in the country's development policy. We have less than 500,000 population. We're an archipelago of 10 islands, 9 of which are inhabited in the northern Atlantic, at the crossroads between various continents, Europe, America, and Africa, for just over 4,000 square kilometers, with volcanic structure. We're exposed to natural risks, geological risks as well, extreme meteorological conditions in terms of torrential rain, droughts which last for long periods. Torrential rains lead to floods which erode the soil, and this of course all leads to degradation of ecosystems, lack of water, and of course problems relating to food security. Various islands, because of their low altitude and the rising sea level, are subject to coastal erosion, which can have a very important impact on the subsistence of the local population and major effects on the development of the country as a whole. And as I was saying this morning, tourism is indeed one of the country's major development objectives, and these natural disaster situations can both be a cause and a result. Despite the progress made by the country, we continue to be very vulnerable economically. The two biggest contributors to the economy, tourism and fishing, mean that we have major infrastructure problems, and there's a huge difficulty in ensuring that the country is capable of dealing with any possible disasters. We're well aware that with all these different vulnerabilities, possibly which are shared by other countries, we're well aware that any disaster could really seriously threaten the future development of the country. The costs of recovery, even after small, quote-unquote, small disasters, are very considerable, and we have very limited capacities in our budget. And we've already had some experiences of this type of disaster, whether it's floods or other natural phenomena. They have, despite the fact that they're, quote, small, unquote, enormous impact. We're well aware then of the impact of climate change. In the case of SIDS, it's not an option, it's a question of survival. The canary still needs to be down in the mine. In Cape Verde, we're working to update our development agenda to incorporate disaster risk reduction and adaptation to climate change. We've got various activities underway, and we are trying to understand the risks for the country. We're subject to various different extremes. We're setting up a national system on risk information, developing a platform to reduce risks, seeking to incorporate into those activities all the public sector, government bodies and civil society. And we've also made an effort with the private sector. We're well aware that we still have much to do, and we are absolutely determined to build up our country's resilience. We don't have the capacity to do this on our own. We do need partnerships, regional, sub-regional, and multilateral. We need technical assistance, and we need words to be translated into action. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Madam Minister, for highlighting the spirit of resilience of SIDS and also stressing that the cost of recovery is very high, even from the small disasters and the national efforts that we are making. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to invite the next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Mohammad Nazim, Minister of Defense of the Republic of the Maldives. Of course, Maldives was again hit by the tsunami, but also it has set up the national coordination mechanism and national disaster management plan after that. So we'll hear more of that from the Minister. You have the floor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. A very good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Small island states, including the Maldives, face unique developmental challenges due to our very nature. As you are aware, the Maldives is an archipelago consisting of small islands scattered across the Indian Ocean. Our island communities are particularly vulnerable to the effects of the climate changes, as well as the natural and man-made disasters. Therefore, we believe that all efforts towards a disaster risk reduction should go hand in hand with climate change adaptation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Maldives is a pioneer among small island nations in the advocating climate change adaptations in the international arena. With the partnership of small similar countries, we have been able to firmly place climate change on the international agenda over the last couple of decades. Though small our voices are being heard, I believe we need to further strengthen our partnership in order to move to the next step from where we are today. To be effective, the small developing states need to present a common front to the world, and I believe events such as these are the paramount importance for us to share our experiences and perspectives and to achieve a common understanding. The population of the Maldives is unevenly distributed among 200 islands that are barely 1 meter above the sea level. For the past few years, we have focused on creating resilient island communities that are empowered to face frequently occurring storm surges, flooding, water shortage, and other disasters. We aim to integrate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in the development, planning, and policy making to facilitate this. Educating and creating awareness among our population on our vulnerabilities and preparing them to respond, adapt, and to mitigate disasters is also a key focus of us. The Maldives tourism industry, the mainstay of our economy, is also looking at integration, adaptation, and mitigation measures in the industry-specific policies, plans, and programs to increase the resiliency of the industry. Within the aim of reducing the vulnerability of the tourism operations and the tourism-related communities to the adverse effects of the climate change and disasters. The industry is also in the process of adopting the concept of climate risk financing solutions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that building strong cross-sector partnership is the key to success in all our initiatives in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Such partnership at the international and the regional level will help us create synergy in our efforts. And such partnership among the small island developing states will help us overcome common challenges as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the clock is ticking, and we need to band together for a collective approach towards disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for highlighting not only the efforts that you are making, but also need for a common front for states to really take up the issue at the global level. Now, I have the pleasure to invite Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, EU Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid, Crisis Response. EU has been a great partner for many small island states for humanitarian aid, crisis response, as well as for long-term development, sustainable development. And we will be definitely hearing about how the EU has been helping the countries to deal with the disaster risk management, but also prepare what you said in the morning, cultures of preparedness and prevention. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much. Before I get into the substance of my presentation, I want to share with you a personal story. Is there anybody from Fiji in the audience? Fiji. Great. In 1990, when the Iron Curtain fell in Europe, I got the incredible privilege to go to the University of South Pacific in Fiji and teach there for 1 semester. And I still remember traveling by train to Belgrade and then by plane to Australia, another plane overnight to Fiji, landing there and having the lady at passport control, taking my passport, typing something on her computer, looking at me and saying, "Where are you from?" I said, "Bulgaria." She typed again and she said, "There is no such country." And as you can imagine, it felt like I was at the end of the world. But it was there in Fiji, in the end of the world, of my world, where I learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. And that was how dangerous climate change is for everyone, but especially for small islands. It has been transformative for me. I since put a lot of professional effort in the fight against climate change. And I find it to be an incredible privilege to be on this panel with so many speakers from the Pacific region, not only from the Pacific, but from small states, island states, and talk about how we in the EU look at this problem. The EU has been on the forefront of the battle against climate change. Even today, during our most difficult hour since the Second World War, where we are going through 5 years of crisis and the end is not yet in sight, we remain firmly committed to promises we have made. In the fast track facility, we have promised 7.5 billion euros, and we are delivering that much plus. But I can tell you, it is not easy for us all to keep our eye on the most dangerous crisis we all face in our generation, that is the climate crisis, because of the deep shadow the economic crisis throws over the world. And that leads me to my first and probably most important point, where small islands are crucial with a big voice to wake us up, to amplify that we need to set our priorities right, and addressing climate change must be a defining priority. And there we in Europe see an enormous opportunity to partner with you. So you keep us focused and honest, and we together may, just may, turn this crisis around. In this partnership between Europe and developing countries at risk, African countries, but also small island states, small developing countries, we in Europe focus on two things. First, it is paramount to reduce loss of life and damage. And for that, solutions must be built bottom up. I was very pleased to hear about San Luce, the community disaster preparedness committees. We very recently, actually on the third anniversary of the Haiti earthquake, I was in Port-au-Prince. We are supporting a very simple traffic light-based system when in dangerous areas on a high point, the community committee places a flag. And if it is green, it's all good. If it is yellow, be prepared. If it is red, households know they have to evacuate to high ground. And we saw in Sandy the damage was much less and the loss of life much, much less. So we believe that that has to be our focus: loss of life, reducing damage, building up local capacity in the most at-risk countries and communities. And secondly, funding. We are, after all, even with all our difficulties, well off in Europe, and we have an obligation to share our fortunes. I can tell you that in the small island states we have had very good programs. We have a facility for 20 million euros facility for the Pacific and 20 million euros facility for the Caribbean, and it has been delivering that kind of small step, big solutions that benefit many people. I run the humanitarian office of the Commission. We have a program called Deep Echo. We have invested 5.5 million euros for 9 projects that again focus on community resilience. More importantly, we have made a firm commitment through a new policy on resilience that in the countries that are most vulnerable to recurrent shocks, we will make this focus on building strength to withstand these shocks a priority in our development cooperation. We are now starting programming for the next 7 years. The so-called 11th European Development Fund is coming, and I urge our partners, including my friends from Fiji and all in the audience, do take advantage of this funding opportunity, because we are talking about 7 years long commitment that is paramount with this length to help build more resilience. We also provide humanitarian aid. Just last year, we have provided 40 million euros to Cuba and to Haiti and to Samoa for life-saving activities. We also find it very important, and I listened to my colleague from New Zealand, to create a planning capacity, ability to absorb, to receive assistance, because countries are so far, so isolated that when something bad happens, help takes a long time to get there. We should not lose any time once we are there to save lives. Let me finish by saying a very simple thing. We humans are incredibly creative, for good and for bad. And the question is how to put our creative energy for good. How to build the solidarity that is the only chance we have to overcome this gravest crisis of our times. 2017, Samoa meeting is coming, and this Bulgarian is going to take... Sorry, did I say 17? Yeah, I'm so sorry. Well, I'm trying to jump into a brighter future. But 2014, this Bulgarian would pack my passport, go to Samoa, and check, does my country exist there? So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner, for going all the way to the end of the world, of course. And, of course, calling all the states to raise their voice, and also highlighting some of the very important collaboration that the EC is providing, from the long-term cooperation to the, the small programs with a big impact to the capacity building and to the resources. Thank you very much for your contribution. Now I have the final speaker for this session, Mr. Andrew Mascray, the lead author of the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction. This latest edition was launched in New York by the UN Secretary General, From Shared Risk to Shared Values, the business case for disaster risk reduction. He will be talking about that more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to use the PowerPoint, please. Okay. I think what we've listened in all the previous presentations is the importance of really building a very solid political and economic imperative to reduce disaster risks in SIDS. To do this, we also need numbers. We actually need credible and solid numbers in terms of what that risk actually is. As part of a global assessment report, we've been managing a global risk modeling effort, which currently now gives us metrics such as estimated annual loss and probable maximum loss for all countries worldwide, including the SIDS. And what I'm going to do is basically run you through, with some slides, what some of those figures look like. Fundamentally, in absolute terms, disaster losses in SIDS actually look very small. You cannot compare the losses in a small island with the losses in countries like Japan. But when we actually put those losses in relative terms, in terms of the actual capital stock that might be lost or the investment that might be lost, they are actually the highest risks in any country group in the world. So what I'm going to present is being developed by a group of scientific institutions from the Americas, from Spain, Italy, Switzerland, Norway, and Australia, and actually with key funding, amongst others, from the European Commission. So SIDS have a very high proportion of their assets at risk. On the right-hand side, you can see the percentage of what we call urban produced capital. So this is urban assets, buildings, infrastructure, etc., that might be lost in a 250-year earthquake. And as you can see, many of the countries there are SIDS. And on the left-hand side, you can see that also expressed as annual average loss. This doesn't mean this is the loss you're going to experience every year, but this is the loss if you actually average out all those extreme events over a long period. This is the kind of loss you might see. So on the right-hand side, you can see countries which have actually got 30, 40, 50% of their total capital stock at risk from earthquakes. This is the same for cyclonic wind damage. Again, very, very high proportions on the right for a single extreme event, but significant proportions on the left as well when that's averaged out annually. Many SIDS are also exposed to tsunamis. So this one is telling us, again, the percentage of urban produced capital that's exposed. Again, all the top countries are SIDS. And on the left one, that's looking at it in a different way as a percentage. And in terms of population, again, the number of people exposed as a percentage of the total population. Almost all the countries, Maldives is obviously right up there at the top, but many of the other countries on that list are also SIDS. Looking at the amount of assets at risk is important, but it's equally important to look at the amount of investment that's at risk. Because if you have a high proportion of your investment at risk, it really means you don't then have the resources to rebuild afterwards. So we've looked at the percentage of investment that could be lost both for earthquakes and from cyclones. And again, the countries, many of the countries with the highest percentage for both earthquakes and the next slide, cyclones, are SIDS. So it doesn't really matter whether we look at the risk from the perspective of assets at risk or whether we look at it from the perspective of investment at risk. SIDS are really amongst the highest risk countries in the world. This also then affects growth. This is a modeling exercise that was done for Jamaica, looking at what GDP might have looked like without cyclones and what GDP would have looked like with cyclones. So disasters for SIDS can mean sluggish growth, not just in the short term, but over many years. And sluggish growth then, again, leads back into having less resources to invest in recovery, and we get into a vicious cycle. To finalize, we think every coin has two sides. So what I've just shown you is, in a sense, the bad side of the coin. But there's a good side as well, because actually the risk is so high. Reducing disaster risk is probably one of the best ways for SIDS to actually gain traction and improve their competitiveness, because almost anything you can do to reduce that risk is going to have an enormous impact on your economy. So that's why we think, disaster risk reduction, if there is a group of countries in the world where it really matters, it's for SIDS. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for highlighting the catastrophic impact of disasters and SIDS, but also at the end you rightly pointed out how you can reduce the risk and in fact gain from really disaster risk management. I think that concludes our opening session. I must say that we have had very thoughtful presentations on how repeated disasters are wreaking havoc on SIDS, but also about national plans for preparedness that they have made, and also the need for further strengthening this global partnership to build their resilience. I think these messages are coming from all the presentations that were made here. It is especially important when you look at the capacity constraint as well as the resource constraint of the SIDS. We also heard that they bear the brunt of disproportionate impact of climate change, which is hardly of their own making. And finally, we also heard that the disasters are undermining the hard-won development gains, and as such, disaster risk has to be mainstream into development agenda. We heard about the proportionality, the need for looking not only about the absolute numbers, but the proportionality of that in terms of their assets and in terms of their total population. I think this relativity is very, very important when we talk about the capacity of the state as well as the people to deal with that. I think that is the perspective that we have to take into account when we talk about partnership, when we talk about next global development agenda. I don't want to summarize everything that has been said, but I would like to offer my sincere thanks to all our distinguished speakers, to begin with, of course, the Deputy Secretary General, but also distinguished ministers from the SIDS as well as the ISTR for their invaluable presentations with deep insight. We'll take up these issues. Let me ask the distinguished audience to give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your participation in the first phase of our debate today. This concludes the presentation by the distinguished panelists, and we will have the change of the speakers here on the table, and there will be another, the continuation of the same dialogue with the experts, moderated by Ms. Liz Ducey, which will commence momentarily. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for staying for this discussion. We had some excellent presentations, which I think got us all thinking about islands. And I think I speak for all of us, and I should say I'm Lise Doucette. I'm a BBC correspondent and presenter, but I'm here today because all of you, like all of you, I care about islands. And all of us here today probably have our favorite island, but we also have our islands that we worry about. And I think we all welcome the fact that in 1992 it was recognized that the small island developing states are a special case. They're special because they are the most vulnerable of countries affected by climate change, but they're also special because they are so beautiful and unique and must be preserved. But they can't be unless we all work together. Just so I know, how many of you come from island states? Very good. Almost everybody. How many of you wish you came from island states? Thank you. Even Mr. Chandra, who comes from beautiful Nepal, thinks he wishes his. Now, this is meant to be a conversation. We want to move the dialogue forward. We heard some of the expressions of concern. We heard what people were doing in the first session from various walks of life, whether from island states or international organizations. We have some experts here on our panel, but you two are all experts. And I just want you to bear in mind some of the outcomes we would like to have from this session. We have just short of 2 hours to discuss, but I want you to keep in mind some of the key points of this global platform. I want to, when you think about the vulnerability of island states and the growing risks, how do we get the private and the public sector to work together better? Maybe you have some good examples, maybe you have some bad examples. We also want to look at how islands can work together, most of all, of course, in regions because they're geographically situated. But even there, I was mentioning earlier how if you look at tourism advertisements, you get tourism advertisements for Jamaica or for Maldives. You don't get them for the Pacific or for the Caribbean states. But by force of circumstance, island communities are going to have to work more closely together. And of course, in our mind are the key dates. Samoa, the conference next year, 2014, where small island development states, the SIDS, will get special consideration. And 2 years from now, the next Hiogo framework, where again, small island states will get special consideration. But I think of all of the issues we're discussing today, and we were in the private sector plenary this morning about talking about the need for local communities to work together. But the world has to work together too. There has to be a strong international commitment. As we just heard from the EU Commissioner, there has got to be solidarity. So thank you very much for taking part. I'm going to give the floor first to an ambassador, and if I may say a film star as well. Ambassador Itirasham Adam is the ambassador to the Maldives here in Geneva, but she was one of the top campaigners for the Maldives when President Nasheed made climate change one of his key issues. You'll remember that moment when they had that underwater news conference of the Maldives cabinet. It put it on the agenda. Itirasham was very much a part of that initiative. She continues to be an advocate, a champion for the fight against climate change. She also played a key role, not just in climate change negotiations in New York, but also the Association of Small Island States, the ISOS. And we've got another speaker. I'll give the floor to you, Ambassador Itirasham.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Moderator Ms. Liz Dorset. It is very good to be here. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honor and pleasure for me to be here today at this important interactive dialogue and to share some of the experiences of SIDS. The fact that this global platform today has featured a SIDS event is a testimony to the recognition of the case of small island states, vulnerabilities, and also the need for future strategies for DRR in SIDS, as noted in the Rio Plus 20 outcome of last June. I would like to first touch on the vulnerabilities. SIDS are amongst those that have contributed the least to climate change, yet we are amongst those that suffer the most, leading to immense social, economic, political, and legal implications in our communities. current lack of ambition to reduce greenhouse gases, inadequate support for adaptation for SIDS means increased vulnerabilities, high exposure to external shocks, and increase in the adverse effects of climate change, adding to the burdens of SIDS to tackle the challenges we face. Studies have shown that natural disasters have risen considerably in SIDS, and climate and weather patterns are expected to continue to change in many parts. Let me also refer to the UN DESA report, which has noted that Samoa, St. Lucia, Grenada, Vanuatu, Tonga, and the Maldives lead the list of 980 countries with the highest economic losses on capital stock in relative terms due to natural disasters from 1970 to 2006. Let's not forget the tsunami in Samoa in 2009 and cyclone events in 2012, tsunami in Solomon Islands in 2010, and most recently in February 2013. Moreover, earthquake in Haiti in 2010, and in 2012, super cyclone Sandy also affected Haiti, Cuba, and Jamaica. I would also like to offer condolences following the disastrous effects of the tornado in Oklahoma last night. Let me just turn to the work to be done by SIDS and also the stakeholders. In 2005, Mauritius' strategy for implementation has recognized the importance of building resilience in SIDS, including through technology transfer and development, capacity building, and human resource development. As such, DRR measures are a good investment in building resilience of SIDS, which can lead to economic opportunities. As we work for an HFA2, SIDS are counting to ensure that these factors are countered. Currently, under the UNFCCC, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOCs, are proposing approaches to deal with the current limitations of disaster risk reduction, risk management, and adaptation to climate change. This is through a proposal to establish an international mechanism to address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change and can no longer be avoided through mitigation nor through adaptation. Governments of SIDS face a set of unique challenges, including small communities spread over vast distances, limited and fragile water resources, limited human and financial resources, and a heightened vulnerability to climate change and natural disasters. These challenges are further compounded by the emerging impacts of climate change, of which the right to safe water and sanitation is a priority. It is a human right. Many of our countries rely on our environment and ecosystem as a source of income generation, and such disasters have caused major depressions on our economies, something most of us are unable to rise from. As reported in the HFACC's report by UNSDR, you would notice that achievements by SIDS on addressing these issues might be below expectations. Speaking on behalf of SIDS and my own country, Maldives, I say that it is not because of lack of commitment from our governments. It is addressing the issues related to disaster risk reduction. Sustainable development continues to be a policy priority, and it will always remain so. As for the Maldives, we have already committed to make the country carbon neutral by 2020 and pledged to make a country a biosphere reserve. Actions on those commitments are already under process. Let me now turn to the private sector engagement and action to be taken. It is important for SIDS to consider investment measures to build resilience and sustain economies. We need to convince the private sector to make concrete measures to ensure if no further harm is made to our islands and invest for a better future. As noted in the Global Assessment Report, geographical distance, weak infrastructure, high transport costs creates constraints for SIDS to be fully engaged in many of its priorities. We need financial and technical resources along with commitments at all levels, local, regional, and international level, to make our voices heard and action to be taken. For SIDS, DRR goes hand in hand with climate change as well as sustainable development. We cannot address one without addressing the other. It has to be an integration of all three components into our socio-economic development plans. While we prepare for the SIDS conference in 2014, it is important that this be considered and action also taken. Many of the SIDS lack capacity, expertise, and resources. We face challenges in building institutional and legal framework in dealing with DRR and bringing it to mainstream development agenda. The costs involved are too far and too great. We need mechanisms for monitoring and accountability. Coordination within all sectors in the society is imperative to ensure inclusive decision-making and policy building. For too long, countries have had to address disaster relief activities instead of disaster prevention or disaster management. Insufficient tools and poor availability of data has limited the scope of our nations to address these issues like many other large nations are able to do so. But we cannot do it alone. We have small populations, small economies, which rely a lot on assistance. As the SIDS engage in these processes to produce a post-2015 development agenda, we rely on our international partners to ensure the unique challenges and vulnerabilities of SIDS are effectively supported and reflected in the necessary outcomes of SIDS 2014 and the post-2015 framework. I thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Ashram, just to give us just a bit more information, if I'm right in saying, of course, for Maldives, one of your big export earners, one of your big contributors to GDP would be tourism. Is that correct? And there's a lot of foreign companies involved in it. I mean, give us an example. That would be one area where if you wanted to develop private-public partnership, where you wanted the message of disaster risk reduction to be driven home, it would be there. Where are you with that? Is there a coordinating mechanism? Is the private sector listening? Is the government approaching them? How is it working now?
Thank you very much. I think we just have a stakeholder kind of consultations within the capital. The tourism industry, the private sector, is very much aware of these vulnerabilities, and because it is since the tsunami, it impacted a lot of resources where the tourists had to be sent off or they had to be managed in such a way. Some of the resorts had to be closed down and rebuilt. So this was really a cost on them, the stakeholders themselves. So they have come into these consultations with the government and other partners. It is at the grassroots level as well. So these consultations have helped them to actually integrate greening policies into their resort plans. And there is also sustainable development frameworks. Some of the resort owners actually promote green leaf or sustainable development policy or award, which is actually promoting awareness in the country. And I see that some of the colleagues from Maldives, Red Crescent are also here. I think this is the kind of cooperation we have with the private sector.
I mean, are they building hotels differently now? Are they building resorts differently?
There are plans. Of course, it is a small island developing country, so it is some of the resources which are already built. They are trying to ensure that these building frameworks, blocks, are actually something that will build resilience. Because it is a lot of cost if you are going to build every other resort from scratch. So I think the new resorts that are built are catering this kind of policies, and government enforce this policy so that it will be a sustainable development mechanism at the national level.
Okay. Now, this obviously is an area we will want to get into in greater detail. I'm going to bring in a few more speakers, but obviously for a lot of the island states, tourism is one of the main drivers of the economy, and that's an absolutely critical area where we want to see evidence of this partnership happening. If it's not happening, why isn't it happening? But let me just bring in to further enrich our conversation, Mr. Jose Rivera is being brought in, and not only is Mr. Jose Rivera from Cuba, he's also a meteorologist, and he's also one of our, well, he could be one of our favorite people, but as we heard from Santa Lucia, it may be that we would listen to Jose with some dread. He is a weatherman. He does the weather forecasting in Cuba. So when I met him, I said, you've been doing it since 1981. You must be famous in Cuba for doing the weather for. Anyone here from Cuba? Have you been listening to? Yes, you would decide whether to bring out your umbrella if Jose tells you it's going to rain. He is the director of the Cuban National Forecasting Center, and he's going to give us, we haven't heard from Cuba yet today, so just Tell us a bit about what you're doing to make yourself less disaster prone. Thank you, Jose. And tell us what the weather's going to be like tomorrow here.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to begin by expressing our most sincere condolences for the victims in the last night's tornado event in the United States. We can remind that Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey last October. 2005, Hurricane Katrina had a major disaster in Louisiana. When you think that the United States is a rich, big country and was badly hit, what will the fate for the small, undeveloped countries in the islands in the open sea? That's the threat we face. It is a common threat of disaster, and we all must unite to face this threat. In our case, Cuba and the islands of the Caribbean, Haiti or Dominican Republic or St. Lucia was here this afternoon. The main disaster, because of the, well, they are most frequent. They are more frequent than earthquake or hurricanes and tropical storms. And the Atlantic Basin is experiencing the busiest period of tropical cyclone activity ever known in the 17 years from 1995 to date. Has been 255 tropical cyclones, of which 116 were tropical storms, 139 were hurricanes. While in the Caribbean Sea, rapid intensification processes have been taking place, highlighting the case of Wilma in 2005. Wilma went from a Category 1 hurricane to a Category 5, a major hurricane in only 18 hours, and Sandy, last year, 2012, passed from a Category 1 hurricane to a Category 3 hurricane, major hurricane also, in just 17 hours, very near the coast of eastern Cuba. The behavior is related to an additional threat, the increase in sea levels, surface temperature, very likely due to the fact that our climate is changing, leading to an increasing of hurricane risk for seats in our Caribbean and Atlantic regions. Cuba had major hurricane-related disasters in history. The hurricane of November the 9th of 1932 vanished the coastal town of Santa Cruz del Sur under a storm surge of 6.5 meters high. The death toll was 3,033 people, and it's the greatest disaster in Cuban history. The second one was related to also Hurricane Flora, 1963. It was because of the rainfall. Rainfall amounts to 1,800 millimeters in 72 hours, caused more than 1,000 people dead. Currently, the civil defense is structured in Cuba as a national system with a strong legal and institutional framework. Scientific institutions are an active part of the system. On this basis, Cuba has experienced remarkable success in protecting its people from the effects of these destructive storms since the beginning of the current period of high hurricane activity in the area. The National Forecast Center began issuing early warnings since Hurricane Lily in 1996. The Forecast Center also began issuing the national TV and radio in a way that has not been done ever before. Weather presenters are meteorologists from the National Forecast Center. They use plain words, they use common words and graphics, simple words to explain all present and future features of the hurricane. On the other hand, the civil defense takes this message and translates it into guidelines, recommendations, and actions to the public and institutions that are also broadcast on TV and radio as early warning messages across the country. The culture achieved by the public is crucial for the good operation of the system. This culture of prevention has been created along years in the country. The students learn elements of meteorology and civil defense since primary and secondary schools. Groups of interest exist with multiple activities and practices in these areas. There are also frequent competitions among students, drawings, composition, and also verification of knowledge in these matters. The daily presence, especially from the National Forecast Center in several weather radio and TV programs, makes the public used to follow, track, and forecast information of any hurricane. From its very formation in some remote part of the Atlantic or the Caribbean, so there is a gradually forming perception of risk in the population that is vital for taking further protection measures by the people. It is also important to appeal to the people's historical memory. For instance, before intense Hurricane Michelle struck the center of the country in 2001, forecasters showed on TV daily, a whole day, pictures of what happened in equally intense hurricanes in 1926 and 1944. So people could have a clear idea of its effect. There have been cases where the information had to be done away from conventions. For instance, when Tropical Storm Noel was approaching eastern Cuba, 2007, in which heavy rainfall located to the east and far away from the center was the main hazard, forecasters told people, forget the center. There's nothing that will happen with the center. The important issue are heavy rains coming hours after the storm center passes. It was indeed a similar situation to Hurricane Flora, I mentioned before, in 1963. Torrential rains and severe flooding occurred in eastern Cuba, but there were no deaths in this time. People were well protected through the evacuation performed by the civil defense and the information they had received. However, in neighboring countries, hundreds of deaths were reported due to the same amounts of rains in this storm. The National Civil Defense System put each of its components in action at the same time. In the case of hurricanes, the National Forecast Center issued forecasts and early warnings to the public and authorities. The national staff of the Civil Defense received a clear message and issues guidelines and actions. The media allows a constant communication with the people. The watch and warning process speaks with just one fully coordinated voice in the country, as it is advocated by the World Meteorological Organization, and that makes the system to work very well. The results are evident. In the 17 years period from 1995 to the past 2012, Cuba was hit by 4 tropical storms, 7 minor hurricanes, and was 8 major hurricanes, and the total number of fatalities were 56, an annual average of 3.3 deaths per year. But there were no deaths in 10 of the tropical cyclones that hit Cuba. These experiences that Cuba can share with other states is that the risk culture of the people should be increased from the earliest ages. Reliable forecasts should be done and issued as accurate as possible in a plain, clear language, for all to understand the message. To do this, forecasters should be trained in communication techniques to ensure understanding of the warning by everyone, with previous events to recall historical memory. The media should cooperate to provide the public service, where forecasters from the National Weather Service, as well as civil protection officers give a clear message to the public without sensationalism. They must also identify vulnerabilities and risk in every place, having planned and organized protective measures beforehand, and then put them into effect from the onset of the event to ensure the protection of all persons at risk. Thank you.
Thank you. So Jose, actually, I was wrong. You do more than just tell people about the weather. You tell them what to do when the weather is a disaster. You help in the public awareness. This is an absolutely crucial point. This is really the grassroots from the very, very early age about disaster awareness, what to do when it strikes. And it strikes, as we heard from Jose, all too often. It's quite an interesting point. Can I just get each of our panelists, because you all come from somewhere different, just to tell me, so when you grew up, did you have, or does it have now, this kind of training, public, from school level, telling people what to prepare for? Just a yes or no?
No.
No. From Maldives, Iritusharm? No? You started. Roland Jacques from the Caribbean? Yes. You started? Long start. Gary from the Haiti?
No, we have started. Training, school children regarding disaster preparedness, but it is not something done nationwide.
Okay. Of course, none of them could say to me, we haven't started. They felt under pressure from Jose. We had to say, at least we've begun it. But it's a very, very good point. But also, all day today, we're discussing about the private-public cooperation. But in Cuba, where, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, the private sector is still in its, you're just developing it. It's not the biggest pillar of your society. So a lot of the emphasis has to go to the state and other local associations, and in this case, education.
There are mixed enterprises between Cuba and hotel owners. There is also an emerging sector of people who owns restaurants and who owns private facilities.
And they're brought into the whole thinking about evacuation plans, preparing for disaster?
All of them, including when someone wants to build a hotel or wants to build a factory, they are obliged by law to make studies of vulnerability in order to prevent, to build something that could be vulnerable. And in the case of the hurricane, for instance, this town of Santa Cruz del Sur was also hit by Hurricane Paloma in 2008, and now this town was rebuilt 5 kilometers inland, so that to diminish vulnerability, not to reproduce it.
Okay, good. So we've heard from Cuba, we've heard from Maldives and South Asia. We're going to go to the other side of the world to hear from Vanuatu. And it's very good that our next speaker comes next, Anis Simon, because next to the weatherman or woman, another one of our favorite kind of people is a cook, and a good cook. And Anis is the kind of cook you need in a disaster-prone area, because she has been helping people to understand how to cook food in a traditional way in case you have to go back to the basics in case of a disaster. And she has actually been instrumental in getting a book out, again back to our public awareness, and it's Yumireri Langwan Disaster, which means, of course, we would all say, we must be ready for a disaster. You have it there, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's got diagrams telling what to do in a disaster. I think everyone should have one of these books. She's an author and a former teacher, and she's a panelist today. Please go ahead, Anis. Tell us about how to be ready for a disaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very grateful to be in front here and present this statement for Pacific Island countries' rural communities. Introduction. The greatest challenges for small Pacific Island states are internal capacities, resources, and geographical isolation. Emerging challenges are related to natural and man-made emergency and can result in disasters with climate change effects. Pacific Island countries are vulnerable to disasters because they are mostly small in size, with low-lying areas and rapidly increasing population. While a lot has been done to improve the dissemination of scientific information and observation to our small countries, what they rely on the most is their traditional knowledge, which is a powerful tool they lean on for guidance in their daily lives. These countries have used their respective traditional knowledge to help them cope with their issues for generations now. which they still strongly value and believe. Few examples include an observation of clouds movement and seabirds' frequent movements in large groups searching for places to shelter is a sign that a cyclone is soon approaching in relation to early warning systems. Rural communities are built into small structures, community disaster committee, which are solely responsible for dissemination of information for house to house or village to village in the event of a disaster. These committees are formed and endorsed by the village or community council, and their main purpose is to manage disaster issues at community and village level, from preparedness right to respond and recovery stages. Some key roles of these committees include working with the province to disseminate information from the national government, fundraise to help the functioning of the committee or assist families recover after disasters, disseminate information to local villages and neighbors in the event of disaster, working with stakeholders or key actors in disaster to raise awareness to increase community knowledge. Threats from natural hazards lowers development efforts and are costly for small communities. Development efforts are costly for small communities. More cost required in structures such as seawalls and causeways, buildings, and roads that are resident to natural and man-made assets. Material costs for utilities and infrastructures are high. Pacific Island countries are vulnerable to natural hazards, which impact development initiatives during their occurrence. When disaster strike, focus on recovery is dominated by the commercial areas, urban settings, most reachable communities, while that's the sad one, while the remote and isolated communities are left out. Pacific Islanders depend on their local produce from their gardens, such as root crops and fruit trees, which are mostly damaged by flooding, cyclones, landslide, or tsunamis. With the inconsistent since then, weather patterns currently experience, some fruit trees take longer to produce, while others come in abundance, but only for a short time. This affects the consumption for both income generation and family intake, with a lot of dependence and development partners to support development initiative during rebuilding and restructuring phase due to the inadequate outsourcing of resource and funds. Most small isolated communities are affected the most. Therefore, national assets and climate change impact can limit, slow, and even stop development efforts in the Pacific and their communities. Lack of resource and capacity to adapt the consistent and...
We're going to get you just to stop there, because you've already given us a lot.
Okay, thanks.
And we'd like to ask you about this great book. Yes, you can just go.
Okay, with my conclusion, Pacific Island countries, while fighting their individual battles to address the threats of natural and man-made disaster with climate change impacts, will continue to rely on stable governance and equal opportunity assist the struggle of people living in the ocean, in the world biggest ocean.
Thank you, Anise. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we had to cut short, because if I didn't, then the others would complain that I gave you more time. You know what it's like. But when you put this book out, what was the response to it? Did people take it up? Did they understand its significance? Did they read it? Did they learn from it?
When I wrote this book, I take it myself to the community, sit with the people, and talk with them. I don't give it to people to go and talk about it. I go to myself, live with the community, and talk about it. because it's in very simple language that all the grassroots can understand.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So we've heard from Vanuatu, we've heard from Cuba, and we heard from Maldives. I want to get the energy going both ways. We've still got 3 more excellent speakers. Do you have any particular question you would like to ask of these 3 in response to any of the points that they made? If you don't have any on this particular, you of course can come in later, because we'll be hearing from the Caribbean efforts to work together. We'll be hearing from the Indian Commission to work together. We'll be hearing from Haiti. But if anyone has anything that a burning question in their mind to ask now, we'd like you to join the discussion. Kenza, yes.
Yes, I was just Vanuatu. I think it's very interesting that your action at the community and I wonder. I mean, this is excellent to have a guide, practical guide for all. But what kind of partners did you have to produce that kind of manual? That to me, I think these are little solutions, but they're key.
Yes, it's right there.
It was funded by OSAID and World Vision. They assist providing funds, and I wrote it. Yeah, it's to help the community to prepare themselves before disaster and after disaster.
So so there's another example. We've heard about solidarity, international cooperation, and commitment. It was your initiative and you carrying it out, local knowledge, but with international assistance to help get it off the ground. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And they were sensitive to when you talked about the content. It had to be in Pidgin English. It had to, when it got to the content, you and your colleagues were in control of the content.
Yeah, but the information have to reach the community because they are the one that... Yeah,
exactly. It was relevant.
Yeah.
It was relevant.
Yeah.
Good. Does anyone else have, please? Even though you actually could hear you perfectly.
Good afternoon. My name is Gail. I'm from the Canadian Red Cross. I just have a question with regards to the Busan aid effectiveness agreements, where DRR was an agreement that was made particularly around SIDS. There was a very special mention about SIDS and an agreement to support much more around disaster risk reduction. I haven't heard that mentioned at all, either by this panel or the earlier one or in some other discussions today. And I'm wondering, have you seen that those commitments are starting to come through for you, and what does that mean?
And specifically, you're referring to which meetings or which?
The Busan aid effectiveness agreements about November 2011.
Okay. Has anyone seen practical manifestations? We've got Mr. Jackson. Yes. Do you want to, even though we haven't, it's your great question. It's about to be addressed. Does anyone else want to? It's about us Canadians. We always can predict. Not earthquakes, but questions. We're pretty good at predicting questions. Do you want to speak to Ashram? Did you see any positive results from applications of that?
Yes, let me just very quickly say that with the UNISDR, actually we've been supported by them and actually helped us to develop the SNAP, which is the Strategic National Action Plan based on our Adaptation Action Plan. So which is very important. We needed to assess the environmental disasters where it is very prone to natural disasters as well as the climate change big issues that are there. So this has been very helpful. I just very briefly want to mention that.
But it's a very important question to ask, because if you go through, there's been an awful lot of conferences, a lot of expressions of support, and if they're not resulting in actual concrete change, actual results on the ground, then I think we have to keep asking why not. And this is what we need to hear from the small island states today, because it's one thing for us to say, oh, we're all really worried about you and this is what we're going to do, but in fact, if it doesn't actually result in something that helps reduce disaster, helps fight against climate change, then there's not much point in it, is there? But thank you very much. We're going to then go to, we'll come back to the floor. Mr. Roland Jackson is from the Caribbean. He was recently appointed the Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and is it CDEMA? 18 Caribbean nations and working on a regional level. He's got extensive experience in disaster risk, so we hope you've been working on disaster risk reduction. Mr. Jackson. And of course, you have a question to answer as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, distinguished moderator, Ms. Doucette, distinguished members of the panel, distinguished delegates in the audience, good afternoon to you. Let me quickly just lend my voice to the condolences expressed to the families and people in the state of Oklahoma who experienced that tornado. I want to start my comments essentially where Andrew Mascray left off in his presentation about why it is important for investment and partnerships in disaster risk reduction to ensure that there is the sustainability of SIDS. And the SEDIMA mechanism is essentially one of the early, I would say, one of the early regional partnerships that were forged around advancing coordination for resilience, the resilience of SIDS. So way back 30 years ago, that emerged primarily around response, but then later developed into more of a risk management, including risk reduction type of framework. We see disaster risk management very much as a developmental issue, not just from a sustainable point of view, but an economic development issue. It affects the very prosperity of our small island development states. And through this Caribbean brand of disaster risk management, we have been able to have established and sustained partnerships with all of our stakeholders, with our countries, our 18 member states, as the fulcrum, as the core of that partnership. It facilitates and builds awareness and knowledge sharing of all the issues, but more importantly, is geared towards generating actions towards reducing risk and building the resilience of our Caribbean, small island developing states. In advancing this argument, I want to put just three key issues or key points on the table. One, looking at governance. One, looking at the partnership towards financing, sustainable financing. And then also looking at some of the emerging partnerships that are coming in the context of the SEDIMA member states. The development and articulation of this comprehensive disaster management strategy has been a consultative process, and this has facilitated wide stakeholder buy-in and has been the catalyst for forging stronger partnerships with not just our member states and civil society, but our donors and development partners. The central focus of this partnership has been towards risk reduction and management in the region, and it has fostered the harmonization of resources that facilitates a direction towards where they invest these contributions within the Caribbean's DRR program. So in the context of the 2011 statement, we've been able to harmonize the support from some of our donors, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. Within this, there's a governance mechanism that has been developed to provide guidance on matters related to the program implementation within the Caribbean. This has served as a successful partnership mechanism, which includes development partners, representatives from the countries, the member countries themselves, sector representatives in tourism, in education, in finance, agriculture, health, and civil society, the private sector, and the non-government organizations. This engagement of partners have fostered advanced integration of risk and climate change considerations at the national level within SIDS, and at the regional level we are buttressing that. On the issue of financing partnerships, one of the things I want to touch on here is that while we have seen tremendous success in the process of advancing risk reduction within the Caribbean landscape, we recognize that there needs to be more targeted investments and work required to build and accelerate on existing and new areas, some of which are embryonic. And in that regard, we are looking at further harmonization of our development partners around the issue of climate change and disaster risk reduction. We feel that there is a need for greater harmonization of the governance, of the programming and the financing, so as to ensure that we have efficient use of these donor resources. We can ill afford waste within small island developing states. So that's an area we'll be looking at. We will also be looking at this whole issue. Well, I want to present the issue within the context of the financing partnership, the issue of differentiation. Here I want to hasten to point out that whilst we have benefited from the donor support, within this context we must be careful to emphasize that the exercise of donor support must not lead to, in terms of differentiation of support, must not lead to further vulnerabilities within the Caribbean small island states. We can explore what differentiation means later. I see your face. But we have to be sure that this doesn't further lead to greater vulnerability within our participating states. Again, we also want to look at the issue of the funding envelopes that are available to small island developing states. What are the opportunities that are there for strengthening this within the context of this Caribbean Strategic Programming Framework? Beyond that, what we see emerging are new partnerships or improving on partnerships with the physical planning and environmental community, looking at the developmental issue. How do we further integrate and mainstream hazard information in development planning, which is critical for areas which have very small land space and a population that is seeking to prosper themselves. Partnerships within ICT, looking at the telecommunications providers within the Caribbean. How can we advance this issue of early warning to the last mile within our communities? And further and continued engagement with our local communities, where we've seen certainly examples of this paying significant dividends. They have significant knowledge and they can help to advance and bring valuable capital to the decision-making process. Sure. We need to ensure that there is...
You need to cooperate as well.
I'm cooperating. I'm cooperating. As key actors in the SID Sustainable Development Program, I think we also have to do more than just suggest that DRR and climate change is a development issue. We need to repackage the language and illustrate in practice the value of investment in disaster risk reduction and climate change as a means of facilitating prosperity for small island developing states. After all, investments in risk reduction does provide new jobs and sustain existing jobs. I'll leave it there. There are others that I would like to share. Thank you, Madam Chair.
It's a very interesting initiative and absolutely crucial to get all these national disaster management organizations to work together. But can you, since we're meeting as a family here today, can you honestly say that it's more of a spirit of cooperation rather than competition, which is driving? Because once you get donors into the mix, it does change the balance somewhat. I mean, I'm sure you're going to say progress has been made, but what is still the toughest challenge?
Well, no, I want to honestly say that I don't think that certainly over the past decade, we have seen competition, certainly within our donor community. I think they've more or less coalesced.
It's the donors who are competing, not the...
Well, I'm going to get to it, but I think the donors have coalesced around the strategy. They've bought into it. They're very much a part of it. They've owned it. And at the country level, there is more of a sharing. There is some competition, and competition is good in instances where it drives progress. But you find within the Caribbean context, rather than a large-scale competition, there is a sharing of experiences, resources, ideas among the very member states and participants. A lot of them are here today, and they've really been driving, the support to each member state. We have to recognize that some are very small. And the other issue we have to look at is how do we then bring the sort of capacity that is required in some of these member states who may not have the technical capacities, may not have the resource capacities. What new modalities can we find that will bring the level of support that is necessary so that these SIDS can also remain sustainable in the search for their prosperity?
Yes, and I like the fact that you say that this regional organization not just strengthens the region, but actually in doing so, it strengthens individual countries at the same time and makes them, because together we're stronger. Now, Mr. Jackson is a great advocate, and we think, well done. This is a really, really good start. Does anyone who's actually, and especially if you're from the region, maybe you have some suggestions or advice or some nice words from Mr. Jackson about how you think it's working or what more could be done in terms of Caribbean countries? As he says, some of them are pretty small. They're great, but they're pretty small to work together. Just specifically on the Caribbean, if you want to add something to the conversation. Yes. You're not Mr. Jackson's brother, are you? Yes.
But Ian King from UNDP, Barbados, and the OECS serve in the Eastern Caribbean, so 10 of the countries that are member states of SEDIMA participating countries. I think I would concur with everything he said. I think in terms of the challenge and the tough areas to address, and I think he phrased it, and I think it was mentioned in the earlier session, we are engaged in a number of different platforms to address development, disaster risk reduction, climate change, sustainable development goals, sustainable development and trade and so on. The issue is how do we bring those perspectives together to address a consistent language. I think one of the challenges small states have is having that consistency across that broad gamut of areas that perhaps larger states are better able to do. And I think sometimes that presents the challenge in ensuring these strategies are mutually reinforcing.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment or question? Yes. Let's get a microphone to see if he's on an aerobics course today.
Thank you. In fact,
where are you from?
My name is Sohail Khan. I'm from Canadian Hunger Foundation. My suggestion, in fact, my suggestion based on my experience, some of the experience in the Caribbean region, we have some program. And based on this program experience, I would like to know as well as suggest that Caribbean region, there are many activities are going on disaster risk reduction, no doubt of that. But I saw that most of the disaster risk reduction activities are very much focused on certain specific areas, for example, infrastructure, or some tourism industry, or some preparedness and community level risk reduction or issues. But I didn't see these disaster risk reduction issues are widely spread into different sectors. Because disaster risk reduction is not only that one or two sectors are affected, agriculture, livestock, water, all these sectors are equally affected. And that is very important for particularly the Caribbean region because countries are small and the resources bases are small. And if one a major disaster strikes, then whole agriculture will be severely affected. I saw that some countries have some better strategies. For example, Jamaica has an agriculture strategy, but I didn't see many other small states. They don't have these kind of things. I would suggest that you should focus on the cross-sectoral strategy on disaster risk reduction rather than focus on one or two or some of the major sectors. Thank you.
Okay, let's hold that point for a second. That's a very good point, but it'll be interesting to see whether it's a question of choices or the fact that not enough resources, you have to focus on priorities. And I hope the Canadian government will be putting money into that. The gentleman in the front. Yeah.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Cletus Springer from St. Lucia, an island shared with Minister Fletcher. Congrats, Ron, on an excellent presentation. Quick point, following on the point made earlier, I think in the context of small island states, we may need to recast the word disaster and focus instead on shocks. Because there are shocks that don't cause disasters in the sense of a natural disaster, but that they do cause severe repercussions throughout the social and economic and environmental system. And where these shocks, internal shocks, coincide with external shocks, like the one caused by the financial crisis of 2008, St. Lucia was hit in the belly of that crisis and is feeling the effects in terms of trying to access credit and financing from the international community. So I think that's a calibration that we might need to make. Thanks.
Very good point. And then I'll just take one from there, and then we'll come back. And then, don't worry, we'll get you the woman just here, and then we'll bring it back to the floor, back to the panel. Thank you.
Hello. I'm Sharmila from Maldivian Red Crescent. I was waiting to hear about the regional systems, and thank you so much for speaking about that. For small island states, especially Maldives, we are a little bit displaced within a region where they're kind of the only small island state in that area. I think Caribbean has a lot of advantages in that area. I was wondering whether the regional system is working on any assessment of transboundary risks. We small island states are very much impacted by different disasters or even shocks and stresses in countries around us. Like in the Maldives, when there's a food insecurity crisis in India, it impacts us more than probably it impacts India. So whether the regional systems are working around that is a question and also a suggestion.
Thank you. We've got shocks and we've got stresses, two words which actually express well. Mr. Jackson, back to you, and then we're going to move to regional cooperation on the other side of the world.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your interventions, all three interventions. Let me say, Sahil, that we did speak of the broad range of sectors which the partnership facilitates, and what we recognized, and I'm going to tie my comment back to all the other two issues raised. The regional system and several national systems are in fact looking at all of these issues, shocks, transboundary risk, but it goes back to the capacity issue of all the member states. And that's why I put on the table the point of view that we have to now look at different partnerships and modalities for delivery of the technical support and capacity to some of our member states. But these are areas that in fact are being looked at in some countries, in others. Our framework covers broader than just those areas, but we have to be careful that we can't choke, if I may use that word, some of our smaller member states with all of these initiatives. We have to essentially assist them along the way. Some can take all, others can't. But it's a real issue that we're looking into. But it comes back down to the capacity issues. And we are, in fact, looking at some of the food security issues around and other issues of transboundary risk, not just in terms of natural, but there are man-made issues as well. Thank you.
Okay. While our minds are thinking about regional cooperation, I'm going to just move down the table, move to the other side of the world, move from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. And Christophe Legrand is now living in Madagascar, where he is an advisor to the UN resident coordinator, but he's also working for the Indian Ocean Commission. We know there are more states in just the Indian Ocean, but he's working mainly for the French-speaking ones, which is Comoros, La France Réunion, Madagascar, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. Tell us about what kind of regional mechanisms have been put in place there to get countries in that area to work more effectively together. Christophe Legrand.
Thank you very much. And I'm actually based in Mauritius, in the headquarters of the Indian Ocean Commission, but it's just nearby. My presentation will just, or remarks, will just focus on the important role of the regional governmental entities can play in DRR for seeds. And I will take also another angle. We are working on disaster reduction, but I will take the risk financing angle to discuss that, because that's where I'm working the most for the Indian Ocean Commission. Also, I would like to say that we are far less advanced than our big brothers of Pacific and Caribbean, and I'm sure that they will have a lot to say on that as well. But when we're talking about partnership for DRR, I think these regional entities can play a big role. For example, we can talk about partnership with global international organizations. In less than 2 years, the project I am working on, with support from the European Union, has been able to develop partnership, financial and technical partnership, with the GFDRR and UNSDR. And I really believe that individual countries could not reach that in that time, and especially in an area where none of the countries, except maybe Madagascar, which is maybe not a seeds, were on the priority list of these two agencies. So I think that's typical of what we can achieve at a regional level. There are also the fact that we can develop much stronger links or seeds inter-regional cooperation. It is far more easier for the Indian Ocean Commission to approach SOPAC, SPCs in the Pacific, or offices like CARICOM, or the offices like Ronald. And why it is important, well, we are the small brother of the seeds. It is really important for us to be able to benefit from their work and past experience. But it's also, when we're talking about seeds 2014 in Samoa, key for, I believe, to have a common position, try to develop a common position for the Pacific, Caribbean, and Western Indian Ocean, and go there. For example, we could have a strong message on what I heard today many times, aligning climate change adaptation and DRR. That's something we are doing. So we could definitely benefit from this type of partnership. I think it will be much more difficult for individual countries, again, to go towards this kind of position statement. There are also partnerships with the private sector. When you discuss about risk transfer mechanisms, you talk immediately about private insurance, and because it's one of the potential mechanisms for disaster risk transfer. So in approaching and pooling the risk around a regional entity of the individual countries, you will have access to products that the private sectors will not make available to any of the individual countries. And they will make it available to you, but they will make it available to a very competitive price. So that's another advantage of regional integration for DRR. And lastly, I think all that make it that you will have much more resources at the regional level and to develop tools, maybe regional tools, but for national implementation or national applications. And I particularly think about data management. We know that data management about loss, looking at hazard, looking at vulnerabilities, is key and even a precondition to any DRR policy or actions. And individual countries don't have the means to develop this database that procure accurate and comprehensive data. If you pass at the regional level, and Pacific is showing it to us with the PACRIF, PCAFRI, the regional program, where they develop this database on risk. And that's something we're also keen to learn about, but I really believe that can be of big use for the individual countries. To finish, I think that acting collectively through regional entities like the Indian Ocean Commission, SOPAC, or others in the Caribbean does not only make sense for seeds, but it's also a question of cost effectiveness, like I mentioned in my remarks. Finally, listening to all the speakers today, it came to my mind that working towards SIDS 2014 in Samoa, we should not be going there begging, but we are leading disaster risk reduction. Everything we heard today shows that we are leaders in innovations and at every level, community levels, and we should go there. We're saying we're not begging. We want you to provide more resources for us to keep this lead and show the world that we are doing things, we are leading by example. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christophe. Because you emphasize the importance of going to these next international gatherings with a common position. If you look across the countries that you're dealing with in the Pacific, what is the greatest obstacle on a national level to moving towards that cooperation? Is it the institutions? Is it the awareness? Is it the lack of qualified experts? What is it that's standing in the way, if you like, from that common position that you emphasize was so necessary?
I think awareness is not the issue. People are living with disasters, and the work of people like we saw in Vanuatu is taking place. People are aware of risk. The problem, I think, is more institutional frameworks at national levels, but also regional. And it's very political.
In what sense?
When you talk about disaster risk reduction, as some people said in the room, you're talking about every sector. You're really talking about sustainable development. And I don't think it's of the comprehension of everybody that you don't have to see DRR as a cost, but as an investment. It's been said today.
So each countries are competing for resources or internally competing?
Not between countries, but
inside.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's more institutional frameworks. In the region for us, it's another challenge. We are part of a region that is being called AIMS. You have three big seeds regions. You have the Pacific, Caribbean, and you have AIMS that stand for Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, South China, and I think that's it. And so that makes it from Singapore to Sao Tome.
And nobody's talking about them all coming together.
It's not a geographical region,
yes.
So for us it's definitely hard to go and prepare towards SIDS 2014 when we're talking about such group.
Because you're divided by many things, including language and history and resources. We've got the Maldives here, and I think Ambassador Tisha wants to come in.
And if you allow me, before, I think there's another thing. Well, I will leave it to you, and I'll come back to you.
Okay,
No, sorry.
we'll come back to you, Christophe. Okay.
Just a quick response. I think my colleague from the Maldives, from Red Crescent, Sharmila, it's really important fact she has mentioned that Maldives is not sitting within the Indian Ocean, the community, whereas the Seychelles and other island countries, the AIMS as it stands, Maldives also is one of the members of AIMS, wherein you have Cape Verde and other countries. But because we are English speaking, and somehow or other we were not able to accede to this group. But then at the same time, we have the SARC Disaster Management Center, which actually caters for the South Asian countries. But the levels of disaster risk reduction and also the vulnerability is different because we have India, we have Bhutan, we have Maldives, we have Nepal. So we have different, but we try to have a cooperation and also some kind of efforts in early warning systems through this. But there is another, within the climate change negotiations, in 2009, actually, Maldives and many SIDS have negotiated with World Bank and other partners to have a SIDS dock, which actually means partnership through the layer of vulnerable small island states. So it is not actually physically being located, but our vulnerabilities are the same as other small island developing states. One, regarding the partnerships and financing, I wanted to mention this, building on capacity. Of course, we receive such assistance. We need more and more assistance as such. But where do the assistance is required? Of course, awareness of, disaster, DRR, or how actually to handle such disasters, which is important. When it is a small island country, it is really open, it is vulnerable. If the sea is just coming and flooding, as we saw in tsunami, whether you're going to a coconut palm or how high it is in the city, it's really, a serious issue. So we need to look at how you actually manage and make people assure that there is some kind of force. For instance, the Red Crescent was mobilized recently during frequent disasters. And the other point I just want to link with that very quickly is a lot of partners do disaster assessments, need assessment papers, studies. It's piling and piling on our shelves. We don't need that much report. Every other project has a consultant who actually takes a lot of percentage, almost 80% of our funds for these kind of reports, which actually is not necessary. We want actually something that is done to the grassroots and something that is delivered. Thank you.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point. And Suhail had a big smile. I think Suhail paid for most of those reports that are on the shelf. But absolutely crucial, because we see this in so many countries, not just island states. People are paying for the studies, and you have had enough of the studies. But you also touched on, I think, what is a sensitive issue in AIMS, because you're an English-speaking country with a different colonial history, that actually you're not part of the wider community. I mean, is that going to be overcome? Is there going to be a movement to try to get all of the AIMS countries to work together, whatever their language and origins, or is that going to be overcome?
There has been some efforts through the UN DESA. We have a regional AIMS meeting every now and then. This will happen again ahead of the preparation of the SIDS conference. So June, July, all the regional AIMS, Caribbean and South Pacific. Whereas Caribbean is also, the regional center is very much developed as SOPAC, South Pacific. The AIMS, I think it is only the Indian Ocean community, whereas some of Singapore and other countries like Maldives are not within that community.
Well, let's hope it moves. Yep. Sorry, Anais, yeah? You want to? Yeah.
I just want to mention something about South Pacific communities. Something that I found in the rural communities, is that they prepare themselves. While meeting the disaster, they fundraise. Because when after disaster, we try to contact the government, non-government, we have communication breakdown. And the Community Disaster Committee, they already arrange, people in the community fundraise. So they do something first before they started contacting governments, donors. So if we are an independent country, I think it's good to do our things. Let's be self-reliant. Do something first before we start looking for donors.
Very important point, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Thank you.
Thank you, and from the grassroots. Before I open it up to the floor, and I think we'll have, and the gentleman with the yellow shirt in the back is on my list. I want to bring in Gary Filotek from Haiti before it gets too close to the end of our discussion. He heads the Haitian relief organization established by the actor Sean Penn after the terrible Haitian earthquake. But in his own career, he's had a quarter of a century experience working in disaster and humanitarian affairs, and he's still smiling and still optimistic. So Gary, I give the floor. Yes, resilience, and he personifies resilience. So Gary, I give you the floor.
Thank you, moderator, for the introduction. And I want also to thank the United Nations for the opportunity offered to JBHO and myself to share experience and lessons learned on disaster reduction. I will focus my presentation mostly on GBHO's experience and also experience in Haiti with integrating risk reduction into disaster response, but from a very practical point of view. Because of its geographical and socio-economic realities, Haiti is vulnerable and has limited resources to prevent and cope with disasters. Let me share with you a few of these realities. Haiti's population is more than 10 million people, living in less than 29,000 square kilometers, of which 80% is mountainous. Haiti forest cover is rapidly depleting, going from 25% in 1980 to 1.4 in 2004. Haiti is located on the path of hurricanes and tropical storms and sits between two major earthquake fault lines. The country is plagued with a long history of political instabilities, 17 presidents in less than 30 years. Here is a brief history of major disasters that hit Haiti during those last 10 years. From 2004 to 2010, more than 7 major hurricanes and tropical storms hit Haiti, causing heavy damage, significant material loss, and major damage in the agricultural production. In 2010, a devastating earthquake caused more than 230,000 deaths and 1.5 million IDPs. During that same year, the country was hit by a cholera epidemic. Now, let's talk about the Haitian experience on integrating disaster response to the 2000 earthquake emergency response. The earthquake created more than 10 million cubic meters of rubble in 30 seconds. So far, 7.5 million cubic meters of rubble were removed. Rubble removal reduced risk of flooding and also created short-term employment to reduce vulnerability, as cash for work approach was used in the rubble removal activities, paying families and people, victims of the earthquake to remove rubble. The internal displaced person relocation program ensured that families were involved in all steps of the relocation process. Relocated families received training on small business development activities and stipend so that they can develop their small business and reduce their economic vulnerabilities. On the housing construction, formal and on-the-job training was provided to local masons and on paraseismic housing construction method, which is a bit new to Haiti, using the code from the Haitian Ministry of Public Works. The activities of collecting and selling used plastic bottles in camps contributed to protect camp environment from flooding and provided cash to the families, because before, initially, plastic bottles used to be thrown out in the streets and open drainage canal. So by the way, this is an activity also that is being carried out nationwide with the support of the private sector. So it is a success story. Drainage canals were built in camps and maintenance systems set up to prevent flooding. So these are a few initiatives that were made regarding disaster risk reduction. Now, let me share with you a few observations, lessons learned, and challenges. Let's talk about local community involvement. We found that the involvement of the local communities and the government is a key element to the success of emergency response. I think other panelists also talked about that. Unfortunately, this involvement was very limited at the beginning of the response, especially for the Haitian government, as most government institutions collapsed with the earthquake. For the construction of housing units, incorporating paraseismic standards, this was a very good initiative, but there is no guarantee that it will continue after the intervention of NGOs, as the government may not have the means to continue to enforce and reinforce the implementation of the National Construction Code. Poverty and instability are aggravating factor to disaster risk reduction. We have a few illustrations. In Haiti, the uncontrolled and marginal building construction, which led to the catastrophe of the 2010 earthquake. Cutting of trees for charcoal production, which is a serious environmental problem. Poor agricultural practices. Lack or non-implementation of public policies. Those are a few illustrations, but there are others, among others. A national environment strategy and financial resources are needed to promote adapted agricultural practices and reduce disaster risk resulting from poor agricultural practices. Regarding infrastructure, disaster risk reduction requires major infrastructure such as dredging of canals, riverbank protection, implementation of watershed management, and those initiatives are often beyond the capacity of the local government. In Haiti, energy substitution is important. Development of and implementation of policies regarding energy substitution should be carried out. More than 75% of Haitian population use charcoal produced from uncontrolled cutting trees for cooking. Over 90% of bakeries, laundries use woods to fuel their boilers. I'm not going to go too much because we have things about reinvent the wheel. NGOs tend to reinvent the wheel, not taking into account the local expertise and professionals that are working in that. Private sector is important, even though it is sadly lacking in Haiti. And centralization can be an added risk. We can talk about later if there are questions about that. And I must say that despite the effort that are being done in the reconstruction and disaster risk effort, Haiti remains very vulnerable. Haiti runs more or less the same risk if there is a new earthquake or if it is hit by major hurricane. Haiti vulnerability is structural. The actions to be taken to reduce the risk must be long-term and should address the root causes of its vulnerability. Some of these causes are lack of public policy, high level of poverty, poor agricultural and construction practices, lack of urban planning, and poor infrastructures. Long-term commitment from donors, the international community, and NGOs, all dedicated to supporting local government, local institutions, and local communities is the only pathway to develop true resiliency. Finally, I must say that these nations are dealing with the same issues. So we have to work together. We have to work as family to address those issues. People, at the beginning of the presentations, there are people that wish to come for Smile Island. So please join us so that we can have one big voice. Thank you very much.
Gary, your smile was so encouraging, but I have to say that your presentation makes me very worried, and I think for the international community, a bit shameful. And because you've just told us, there's not a single person in this room who doesn't know what the Haitian earthquake looked like, how much pain and destruction it caused. We saw there was a tsunami of relief that went to Haiti. People opened their hearts to Haiti. And now you're saying that, despite the housing units with some paraseismic materials, that when the NGOs go, the government may not be able to enforce the protection code, that if there's another earthquake, which there more likely will be, that Haiti will not be able to survive. I mean, it's almost as if we're watching a car crash about to happen. I mean, how do you explain this?
No, I think besides the initiative and solidarity.
Well, that was there, but results matter more.
Yeah, from the international community, there was a lot of.
Oh, sorry. I think despite the solidarity, there were a lot of good results that were achieved.
But what we're talking about today is disaster risk reduction, and you haven't left us feeling very reassured that when it happens again, it has happened in our time, Haiti will be able to have the buildings and the infrastructure and the knowledge to survive it in a better way than it did the last one.
But I think disaster risk reduction is a long process because it also goes through behavioral change. It also goes into implementation of policies. Despite efforts that have been done, I think Haiti still have a long way to go. And good experience and lessons were learned from the process. But I think also that we need to continue to think about it, to learn from the lessons and to adapt them. And more importantly, learn from the communities. Learn from their coping strategy, learn from their experience, and integrate that into national policies and practices.
Thank you, Gary. And I think that is one of the issues that has come up again and again, that we have to listen to local communities who know best. Now, I'm told we can go a little bit past 6 because we started a bit late. I want to open the floor again to questions and comments. The gentleman in the back. Oh, just a minute. The man with the yellow shirt. I promised him and I must keep my promises. And then it will be the man with the white shirt. Yellow first.
Thank you. I'm Gustavo Lara from Dominican Republic, Red Cross, quite neighbor to Haiti. And I want to make a contribution. I heard the Haiti Interior Minister say that it's time now to strengthen the cooperation between our countries in the region. And you have started now, Professor, that we need to increase our capacities. But what is the experience? I heard everybody here talking about the problem, the storm, or talking about focusing in the menace. But we have to change and look to the vulnerability. We have to become proactive. The vulnerability is there 24 hours a day, so we have to talk and to work 24 hours a day, reducing vulnerability and increasing the capacity, as you say, the capacity of the community. I want to encourage all the stakeholders here to sit with our leaders in the region. Ronald is leading a process. Ronald Jackson is leading now a process in the region, trying to support the exchange between the South-to-South cooperation. Dominican Republic is another initiative with a hope for initiative, South-to-South cooperation between the region. But we need all the stakeholders to sit in the table and to know that it's better peer-to-peer capacity building. Focuses on building the capacity between our nationals, supporting each other.
Yes, thank you.
It's good to do it now.
Yes, good. Thank you very, very much. The gentleman in the back, and then there'll be the lady in the front. Yes, we'll have to keep them shorter because we're running. Yes, go ahead, please. Bonsoir.
Good evening. I'm going to speak in French because I'm from Haiti, and it's a question that concerns my country with regards to international assistance aid. With regards to Raoul Book's film, which explains how this aid has been used, and a lot of it has been returned to the donor countries, and also with regards to the experts. Less than 40% has been used in the countries and in their communities. So this is a film which is in different languages, and I think it should be seen as much as possible internationally. I would like to talk with regards also to the Pacific, who are promoting for a common position. I think that Haiti needs to have a common position with the other countries of the region so that we can have a common strategy, and that we should have a position that's efficient to have a strategy to reduce carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, this in the front.
Hi, I just want to come back to...
Where are you, your name and where you from?
Adelaide, I'm from the Commonwealth Secretariat. So I just want to come back to a point that Mr. Jackson made, and if you don't mind my saying, a slightly loaded statement about the international investment potentially rendering SIDS more vulnerable. You mentioned good governance, which I think probably warrants a whole separate session in relation to disaster risk reduction. But my point is that a lot of SIDS obviously suffer from weak governance institutions and a lack of leadership. And as far as I understand it, a lot of the international funds for DIR and climate change do require sort of high-level reporting and accountability of recipient governments. My fear is that a lot of these SIDS may find themselves exempt and turned off by the requirements that are demanded. And is there enough awareness of other funds that can help with DRR and climate change?
Okay, so we have two questions on aid and two comments and urging in terms of cooperation. Why don't you want to answer the one because you had raised that issue? And if you would want to this idea that, you know, it's been the criticism there for a long time that the vast majority of aid, particularly from Western countries, goes back to the countries of origin because it's paying for experts and supplies from those countries. But go ahead, and we'll also address the issue of cooperation again.
Quickly on your last point, I think it is very important that any intervention that happens in the region seeks to build the regional capacity. A lot of expertise exists within the region, and I think we need to continue to invest in those expertise as part of building resilience of the region. That's the base of that. On the issue of differentiation, what it is that there are donor envelopes which exclude certain member countries by virtue of a designation of them being developed or developing. That is the context within which I speak of differentiation may lead to the further vulnerabilities, because there are small island developing states. They do face the same problems that all the other small island developing states face, and they are very exposed and very fragile as it relates to the climate hazards and other natural and man-made hazards. So I don't think they should be excluded, and that is what my statement essentially referred to. On the matter of other resources, I think it is very important that as we discuss partnerships, that governments must be a main partner in that financing process. It can't only be our donor partners. Our governments must invest as well within this construct of the partnership towards reducing risk. And so if we were talking about other resources, that would be the resourcing that we would talk about. But to finally go back to your point of the risk of not being able to access those resources because of the issue of governance, one of the things we want to put on the table is that there are existing models. What we're seeing is a creation of separate or parallel mechanisms for dealing with, for example, climate financing and climate change adaptation financing, let me say that. Okay. When I think the disaster risk reduction model is a very good vehicle for also addressing the management of climate change adaptation resources in SIDS.
Good. I'm going to take it as a given that we all agree on the need for more regional cooperation. The point was made eloquently, both by the man in the yellow shirt and the man in the white shirt. Thank you very, very much. We are going to have to draw this to a close soon, but we have the expert participation of Mr. Gayan Chandra Acharya, who moderated the first session, who, of course, from Nepal, but also the UN High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, who's just going to give us a few remarks in order to bring the session to a close. Mr. Acharya, would you like to?
Thank you, Ms. Moderator, Lise Doucet, and distinguished panelists and distinguished delegates. I think we have heard a very good presentation from all perspectives, from the perspective of the communities, from the perspective of the national governments, from the perspective of the international partnership, as well as regional cooperation. I think that gives us a very holistic view of not only the challenges, but also the opportunities for SIDS. I just would like to stress a couple of points. That's what is coming in all the discussions that we have had in the morning in different sessions as well. One of the challenges that we still face is that it is not only the small islands that we are looking at. I think the countries are also saying that we are looking at the large oceans they are custodian of. I think linking that perspective is very important when you talk about the challenges of the small islands. You are talking about the islands with 90% more of their resources, if you include the exclusive economic zone, they are responsible for. So the health of the islands and the surrounding area is not only important for the people living in the islands, it's a global public good that they are responsible for. So I think that perspective perhaps should also be looked at when we talk about international partnership, when we talk about, as you said correctly, there are many innovative solutions that you talk about, and I think this perspective of the custodian of a large oceanscape must come forward when we talk about the the small islands. The second issue that I would like to really focus on is, of course, disasters are happening all the time. It happens in many countries, but again, that what we see is that it is the disproportionality in the small island states that we have to take into account. Whether it is the asset or whether it is the number of people that, the loss of lives, this disproportionate impact, and as you have heard all the time saying that the reasons for such big disasters are climate change induced, and small island states have very little to do with that. That's why this again brings out this global cooperation issue very much into the central focus of the small islands. So that's the second point that I would like to really stress on. The third point that I would also like to stress is that whenever we talk about disaster, it is infrastructure for early warning that is very important. It is institutions that are very important. And third, it is resources. So if you don't have these three things together, then the disaster risk reduction as well as disaster preparedness and building resilience, in fact, which is the most important thing, will be really negatively affected. That's why when we talk about providing help as well as strengthening the capacity of the SIDS countries, you have to look at it again in a holistic manner through infrastructure, institutional mechanism, which includes capacity building as well, and then the resources. That's what I would like to stress on. And the fourth point that I would like to say that, of course, the mainstreaming disaster preparedness into the national development plans is really critical. And when we say that, this mainstreaming, even the early warning system, the community involvement, building of resilient infrastructure, has to be part of the national development plan. It cannot be seen in isolation and built in isolation. That has to be really part of the whole development agenda for the small islands. And the other issue that I would like to say, I think there has been a lot of talk about multi-stakeholder approach. That is critical. Whenever we look at the resources and we look at the, the solutions, innovative solutions to many different problems, I think there are business sense. When you look at the small islands, the majority of the countries are dependent on tourism. Now, how does that tourism work? There are many players which are business sectors which are involved in tourism. And if you don't have the marine protection, the coastal protection, or the, the protection of the livelihood of the people living in the islands, they will not have tourism. That's why this has to be linked with the tourism sector in a more organic manner than before. And there has to be a very strong, this value addition in the small islands itself and the integration of the livelihood of the people in the tourism sector in order to make sure that this not becomes only a business model, but a development model for these countries. And one more thing that I would like to say is that the SIDS issues have to be on the front of the post-2015 development agenda as well as the disaster risk reduction. And I do hope that when we have this type of a debate, leading by example, regional cooperation, multi-stakeholder approach, community participation, And all of that, together with the global partnership, I'm sure that all these angles will be taken together when we talk about post-2015 development agenda, as well as the CITES conference in 2014. And very importantly, it is very important in terms of the timing that it is coming before 2015 climate change agreement and also before 2015 post-development agenda. I hope that it will all really inform all these global conferences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So much to do, so little time. Before we go to the reception, and I think one of the great things about these conversations is now you can put faces and experiences to the names in front of you and do engage them in conversation in the reception. But I want each of them, because I'm feeling they have a lot to bring to the conversation, but the time went by quickly. One thought, very quick thought, the most important priority for you in moving toward a more resilient society where you come from. Just a thought from each of you, a takeaway. Starting with you, Anis, what would you say for you when you go back to Vanuatu, your most important priority?
When I go back to Vanuatu, I'm going to get this message back to the rural communities and tell them what we've been talking about, what other countries have been sharing. And I'm going to tell them that what rural communities are doing, it's the best way to live and go about disaster. Because they live in their own community, respected community, and they manage themselves. So any disaster that strike, they always know how to go about it. I think that's all.
Thank you. And Annie says it has actually a talk show, so she will be having a call-in program about our session today. Thank you. Gary?
Yeah, thanks. No, before going to my point, I just wanted to make a comment regarding the international assistance. I think Haiti benefits from a great international solidarity. Whatever the way, if there are issues regarding the use of the assistance, but I think Haiti benefited a lot from this. And one of the great things that happened in Haiti was the rubble removal. That changed the face of Port-au-Prince, that changed the face of areas affected by the earthquake. Now Haiti is moving towards building hotels, and it could not be possible without rubble removal. So we want to be back in the touristic map as a country. And we continue to count on the solidarity, international solidarity, but we have to acknowledge that it was very useful and helped Haiti a lot.
Thank you.
So I want one point that
only one, because just one last point from you, Gary, that everyone should take away from home. You'll go back to Haiti. What's going to be your top priority?
Yeah, I'm coming to that.
But you got 4 sentences. Just choose one.
Exchange of experience and lessons learned are important. It's very important to deal with vulnerability and to deal with disaster reduction. So I think this is the key point that I would highlight.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson?
Continue with the process of finding alternative modalities to strengthen the technical capacity and resourcing of our member states. They're at the center.
Very good point. Ambassador Itirasham?
Thank you. I would like to say, due to the special and unique vulnerabilities of SIDS, as we've been hearing the whole day, we need to specifically have building up capacity, building better, and also have resilience in our systems. We need DRR expertise, institutional framework building, and also we need to have a legal framework in place. And I think on top of that, there is a need for us to engage in this kind of global process very proactively, as the gentleman at the back says. Thank you.
Thank you. And Cuba's favorite weatherman?
Well, need to educate and create awareness in people from earlier ages. Also to train specialists to speak clear so that everybody understands, and to make the civil protection system capable of reaching all sectors to lessen vulnerabilities and risk.
Very good point. And Christophe, would you go back to Mauritius?
Maybe a surprising one, but it came to my mind listening to the man from Haiti. Don't leave it to DRM managers and specialists, but maybe involve strongly ministries of finance as actors for resilience.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for staying with this session. I'll leave you with one last thought which has been on my mind, that throughout this conversation that we've had, the excellent sessions from all of our panelists, in front of me, although we didn't hear from the delegation from Fiji, there has been a woman with a lovely Fijian flower in her, tucked behind. Samoa! Oh, Samoa, okay, well, even better. If the flower can survive the global platform for disaster risk reduction, then let us hope there is greater hope that the small island developing states will also survive. It's a beautiful flower. Thank you very much.